So Daniel will start lighting the candles. Come here. Come. He's going to light the candle in memory of his grandfather, Daniel Lemkin. Right, Daniel? And his name after, Daniel Lemkin. Okay, let go. Okay, I'm giving you something else.
Okay, it's fine. It worked. Yeah.
Now you're starting. Come in, David. Come.
So I think almost everybody here has not heard most of what I'm going to say. Could be a few friends have heard some of it. But I spoke about this for the first time a year ago, because I once was at the Karlbach Shul for Sudar Shlishit, and I, in brief, spoke about my father and his experiences in Germany after World War II, and somebody, Gil Karasanti, who heard it, thought of inviting me to speak at the Zichron B'Salon. That's what it's called. Zichron B'Salon. I spoke in the Hebrew version last year, so now I'm giving the English version. So first, I guess I give my general family background. That I'm born in America, as well as all my siblings. My mother's from America. Her parents are from America. I think her grandparents were immigrants. My father came to he was a survivor of the Holocaust era, and he died in 1988. While I was at Cornell University, I basically took a flight from Cornell, and when I landed, I found out that he had died. He would have been 100 this summer, and he was only 68 years old. So my mother's quite a bit younger than him, and I mean, she lived well. She's living in America, and along with all my siblings, I made Aliyah in 1992. So all of basically my siblings and I are all named after Holocaust victims. I'm named after my grandfather, my father's father, and my father's oldest brother, Avraham. So I'm Binyamin Avraham. My brother is named after Yosef, who was one of my father's brothers who was murdered. Rachel, my sister, is named after my grandmother. And my brother Jonathan, or Yonah, is named after another relative. I'm sure it's an uncle or a cousin, who was also murdered. So first of all, in terms of the mentality I think that it's important to emphasize that the second generation of Holocaust survivors certainly have are in a category unto themselves. I definitely think that you're very influenced. You grow up knowing that your grandparents perhaps went into gas chambers. My grandparents were murdered in Auschwitz. I don't know how, if it was of starvation, disease, in a gas chamber. But certainly when you grow up with that knowledge, it definitely weighs on you heavily. And I think it definitely makes you more sensitive to both the issue of the Holocaust and to the issue of modern day attacks on Jews in general, whether in Israel or around the world, as we saw just the other day in California. Interestingly, so my father was from Volkovisk, which is the part of Poland which was Poland before World War II and is now Belarus. The way he survived was the Russian army. I know much of what I'm telling you. I know through my mother. My father didn't talk too much about the Holocaust. In 1940, my father was recruited into the Russian army. My mother felt at that time, or my grandparents, the family felt that he had the best chance of surviving. He had the best personality that would enable him to survive, because basically, as my mother just told me again last night, if you were being taken to the Russian army, it was considered as though it was like a life sentence, and you were almost certainly going to die. So they assumed that he would probably die. But they also felt that if somebody was going to go through that and survive, that he would have the best chance. So he was taken. When he was in the army, he was trained for dirty work, my mother tells me, digging trenches, not for carrying weapons. But while he was in the army, he had excellent interpersonal skills, very well liked, and he befriended generals, and in particular an Armenian general, and together they engaged in commercial activities on the side, smuggled gold on the black market, and that's how he basically survived, by being on the black market. So much of the war, some of the war, he was actually doing something in the army, in the Russian army, and much of the time he was doing activities in the Armenian, with this Armenian general. There's a book here. I mentioned the book. This book is written by, I'm sort of jumping around even though I prepared notes, but it's hard not to jump around. This book, before my father passed away, he was very good friends with this man. He was a builder who lived in Petah Tikva. I was once in his house when I was here in Israel in 1986. And he put together this book, and my father urged him to put together, and actually at the end of the book he writes a whole couple of pages about my father and his experiences and his family. And here's a picture of my family, here's a picture of my father. Later on I'll mention this when he met with Yitzhak Shamir. So my mother tells me that my father was like number one, like one of the most wanted people in Russia, like on a wanted list for the black market activities. He had a gun and he would run from place to place. He was captured at one point. At one point he spent 3 months in a Russian hospital. He pretended to be sick by putting he wanted to stay there. He pretended he was sick by putting a thermometer in a cup of tea. I think he also flirted with the nurses, the doctors, that also helped. Once he was being pursued by I believe it's the equivalent of the FBI in Russia, I believe is the KGB, I think. Whatever it was, they were pursuing him. They found his hiding place apparently in a store area. And so when he came through the front door, they came through the front door, he went through the back door after he had a gun under his pillow. At one point he had been on a military wagon, and he, just like something you see in a movie, he jumped off the wagon into the woods to escape the army. I guess it's similar. Also, the image in people's minds is always people that would jump from the train, right, on the way to Auschwitz. But this was another, I guess, also life-saving measure. One thing my father did, he had an uncle Fisher, Samuel Fisher, who was his mother's brother, who he survived the Holocaust, and we used to visit him very often on Sundays. He lived in the Lower East Side, and he was taken to Siberia for being a wealthy jeweler who owned property. I guess they said, you own property, you're going to jail. So you're going to be in prison. So one of my father's experiences, we actually trekked all the way to Siberia to find him, and the snow was sometimes knee deep. One of the interesting things, one of the things I wanted to mention was that, first of all, like I said, my grandparents were murdered in Auschwitz, along with one of the brothers, I believe it was Chaim, and there was another two brothers, Yosef and Avram and Yosef were in the partisans. And they were murdered when at one point, these two partisan divisions split up. They came back towards my father's hometown of Volkovisk, and then one of the brothers, it's testified to in this book that one of the brothers was shot in front of my grandparents. One of the very, from a religious perspective of divine providence, Hashkafa Pratit, a very interesting thing that my mother told me about in recent years. I think she said this quite a few times, but I didn't recall it. Was my mother's birthday is January 27th, 1943, and one of the memories I have as a kid was I would sometimes go into the kitchen, and my father late at night would be reading books about his hometown, and he would be crying. My mother actually feels that one of the reasons he died, what led to his disease, having ulcers and a heart condition in the end, was she feels he got ulcers as a result of thinking about the Holocaust and his family and his hometown. So. What's interesting about January 27th, 1943, so my mother, she saw my father very, sitting in the kitchen reading these books a lot, and she said, you know what, I want to see what's in these books myself. So one day, 2 or 3, she told me just this now, I saw 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, she goes and looks at these books, and she looks up the part of one of these Holocaust documentation books, this isn't the only, but there's another very big book that documents the story of Volkovisk, and I think other towns as well. And in the book, she looked up the family Lemkin, and she saw that the day that my 2 uncles who were in the partisans were murdered was January 27th, 1943. So she was born the day that they were murdered. Now my mother had been married previously. My mother was widowed. She was only married for 8 months, and then her first husband, I think, slipped on ice in Albany, and he was killed in Albany. And then my mother said, so she got remarried to my father not too long after. And my mother told me she sometimes tried to imagine, like, what's the meaning of all of this? Why did this happen? And so she said, especially when she saw that she was born on the day that my father's two of my father's brothers were died, she felt that this is what she called bashert. This shows that my destiny was to make sure to carry on the Lemkin name. First of all, there's other things I want to mention about my father, but first of all, I want to get to the crux of the matter in terms of the most unique part of the story. The standard, although there are stories of Jews taking vengeance against Germans and Poles and whoever needed to be rid of during the war and even after the war. But again, that's not the standard story. The standard story, you hear more the victims who were unable usually to fight back. So my father came after he had been in Russia during the war. Ultimately, he had wanted to. Actually, he was very into Eretz Yisrael. My father, in this book, it says that when my father was in Volkovisk, he was in a Zionist youth group, and he used to go to the local river and pretend it was the rivers in Israel. So he had wanted to come. He had wanted to come to Israel, but as he explains, in the end, the editor of the book parted ways. He ended up coming to Israel. My father ended up coming back as a tourist several times. In any case, so when my father, after World War II, he got to Germany. So he was, again, I think he was also involved with black market activity. He was going up, I think, to the north of Germany, bring back what my mother says, babushkas from the north of Germany, and then selling them in the south of Germany. And he had a limousine driver. He was doing very well. As he had been, I think he had been doing very well in Russia as well. And economically speaking. And so what's interesting, so he was there, he was in Germany, and then it was in 1950, in the early 1950s that he came to America from Germany. He had been several years in Germany. So after my father passed away in 1988, I just happened to be speaking to, we used to have a cousin named Benny Nitzan in Haifa, one of my father's cousins. And he tells me that when your father, when he was alive, when he was in Germany, he had a limousine driver, and they used to go at night. He would go out attacking Germans. Now I don't know. Again, I don't know which Germans these were. I have no other information about it. That's something very interesting. You hear about your father after he died. You say something like that. You would have thought to have heard about when he was alive. Although obviously Holocaust survivors in general very, very often didn't want to talk about it, and in this case, probably maybe he had reason to be secretive about it. I mean, to do something like that, you might want to be quiet for the rest of your life. So as apparently he was, more or less, with the exception of who he told. So he told my cousin Benny Nitzan. Now I told my mother And then I said, yeah, my father told me that when he was alive, early in our marriage, they got married in, I think, 1965, and 64, 65. And your father said early on in our marriage that when he was in Germany, he had a Luger gun, and he had a limousine driver with a limousine, and that at night things would just happen. It would go and certain Germans would be attacked. So, I mean, what I don't know, I guess, is much more. With the fact that I don't know this, I think is maybe the most interesting part of the story. That after you grow up and your father passes away, and just then you find out about it. It's interesting. It's also something I'm proud of. Some people here who know my opinions about things might understand why. As I said, when you're growing up as the son of a Holocaust survivor, I think on some level you also feel like you're a survivor. You definitely do. I mean, think about it. His whole family, he had a pretty big family. I think the Lemkin family there was very big, and you feel like you yourself are a survivor. Another thing I wanted to mention is that my father was cousins with Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide and drafted the genocide resolution. He was a fairly close cousin, I believe. My father was in touch with him, and he paid for his funeral, because he was an idealist for that cause, which, by the way, he was motivated. I looked this up. He was motivated to fight against genocide because of two things: the Holocaust and the Arab rioting against Jews in the 1930s. Of course, you're not going to hear that from the left-wing human rights activists who banned who now he's getting. If you look it up, you'll see now he's getting more and more popular. My mother used to say when he was a kid, "Why is everybody talking about Martin Luther King so much? He just fought for the civil rights of blacks in America." Raphael Lemkin, he was fighting against the genocide wherever it might be. Of course, my fear is always that it would be used chas v'sholom against Israel, and Bezrat Hashem, they won't use his name in that regard. Although it won't surprise me if they do. Just a few anecdotal things. I remember my father mentioning that when he was, my father took him to hear Jabotinsky speak somewhere around Volkovisk, and he remembered the leftists at the time throwing rocks at Jabotinsky, which is also very interesting, because there's always the image that the right wing is the violent ones, but the unknown history is all the violence coming from the left. Another thing I always remember, my father, he did not talk much about his experiences, but he always had certain themes that I heard him speak in regards to the Holocaust. One of them, which I guess he had in I forgot to mention an important part. There's so much that is he always talked about how the Poles helped the Germans get the job done. So that's why even I have on my Facebook page, I always bring that up, because it's like I feel the need to testify to that fact, that my father's direct witness to that, and yet the Poles made a law saying that you're not allowed to say it. You're not allowed to say that the Polish state was involved. Maybe the Polish state officially wasn't because they didn't exist, but the Polish nation obviously were cooperating overwhelmingly. The amount of Poles that were not, maybe there were 20%, there were righteous Poles, but the vast majority were not. Another thing, whenever somebody would say, condemn Israel or certain right-wing leaning type people in Israel, and they would say, well, you can't do that, what is the world going to say? So I have to say, well, my father's like, visceral reaction will be, well, where was the world during the Holocaust? Like, even though maybe it doesn't sound like it makes sense, but it does if you think about it. In other words, they weren't there for us there, they're not for us now. You have to do what you have to do. Of course, believe in Hashem and do things based on what the Torah says, but you have to do what you have to do, not worry about what the Goyim, because the Goyim they're going to hate you no matter what you do. You say, you do it this way, they're going to hate you. You do it that way, they're going to hate you. So the one thing I have to mention, is that and this is actually interesting because it connects to maybe my father's actions in Germany, is that when Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir was Prime Minister in the 1980s, so my father organized. My father had gone to school apparently with him in either Volkovisk or Bialystok, and my father organized a meeting with him when he was prime minister when he came to New York. I would have gone, but I was up in upstate New York at the time in university, so I didn't go. But the one thing that I again, this is complete speculation. It's known that Shamir, it's documented obviously that he was the head of the Mossad in the early 50s. In the 40s, obviously in the early 40s, he was involved with the underground movement. In the later 40s, after the Holocaust, I don't remember the history offhand, but I'm wondering if somehow whatever my father was doing in Germany maybe had some underground connection to Shamir. I mean, we have to remember even Shamir, when I read just the other day that when Shamir was the head of the Mossad, one of the things they did was kill German scientists who were trying to help Egyptians get missiles this was back in the 1950s. So I don't know, it's a complete speculation. I'm just wondering. Now maybe I'll just quickly, I think I've taken enough time, so I'll show a few pictures, so you'll see maybe the face behind the... Yeah, also I'll show that as well. This picture of my family, my father, my mother, that's me. This is my father with Benny Nitzan, who told me after my father passed away that what he had done in Germany. When I was one of the things, I didn't mention this, is also in what I wrote, but I deviated from the script. My father used to be my stage manager when I was a kid. I used to sing in English, Hebrew, and Yiddish, both in choirs and also as a soloist and in concerts. So I also sang at his Landsleit. We often went to Landsleit meetings where his Landsleit would be, so I sometimes would sing there. This is me with one of the Landsleit. This is a picture of me, my brothers and sister. This is a picture of me singing somewhere. There's another picture of Shamir from that meeting. This is my father. It's a memorial for Volkovisk when he came into Israel, when the monument was put up for Volkovisk. This is me and my father at the beach. Another picture of my father, and this is the picture you could see that's in the advertisement for this talk and in this book with Prime Minister Shamir. One other thing I must show is, interestingly, there's another date that's interesting actually. We have several people in my family that are born on February 14th. Barbara's sister, my brother, and Talia, my daughter, are all born on February 14th. February 14th, 1938, my grandmother wrote a letter in Yiddish here to people in America telling them to take care of my father, somehow asking them to help my father in some way. I don't know. I still have to get this translated. I don't know if anyone understands Yiddish here, but they could look at it. One last thing I wanted to say, just in memory of my father's father, which is an interesting story. My father had right after the war, my father, when he came back to Volkovisk to see what was going on, it's described in the book, he found out basically how everybody was murdered. And one of the people there was, he said he met some fellow Volkoviskers there. One of them was this Dr. Resnick. I remember Dr. Resnick was always in touch with my father over the years in America. He was, part of the Landsleit group. And once when I called him up from Israel many years ago, when I already had moved to Israel, I called him up. He was in Florida, and he told me that first of all, he told me when he heard that I lived in Israel, he said, "You're a real Lemkin," because he knew the Lemkins of Volkovisk. So I said, "You moved to Israel, you're a real Lemkin." That's one thing he said. The second thing he said was, he had been when Jews were being gathered together to be transported to death camps. So they were first put in some type of a barracks, some type of ghetto area. I don't remember where it was. They took them from Volkovisk to this gathering area where they were, and the conditions were very bad. People were very sick, and they were already dying there. And this Dr. Resnick was there. Dr. Resnick was there. And he said that he saw my grandfather, who by the way was also it says he was huge. You look at a picture of him, it looked like he was at least 6'5". Look at a picture of him. And he was known as the tallest person tallest Jew at least in Volkovisk. And he had The story is either that he had his own rations of food, like a big type of pot of soup or something, and he went around from person to person feeding them soup. My mother says maybe it was also his own rations that he was giving out food to from person to person, feeding people. And it just touched me very much to this day when I think what Dr. Resnick said. He was already a man in his 90s when I spoke to him there in Florida. He said to me that in his entire life he never saw such a great act of Ben Adam Chavero as when he saw my grandfather helping people who needed that food. Anyway, thank you everybody for coming.